To discuss the situation in Libya, we're joined now from Washington by US defence strategist Harlan Ullman. Harlan Ullman, welcome to Lateline.
Nice to be with you.
Asked last week about a no-fly zone, you said, quote, it's very unlikely the international community would be sufficiently mobilised based on a very unhappy track record in Iraq and Afghanistan. Are you surprised by the UN decision?
I am, and I think that one of the reasons that this took place was probably awfully good diplomacy by the Obama administration. Clearly getting the Russians and the Chinese to abstain was a very, very big deal because, as we'll discuss in a minute, this is not going to be a very simple operation. And similarly, engaging the Arab League as well as the Egyptians now gives the international and Arab support that was critical. But the issue here is that the international community has turned against Gaddafi, rightfully so, and I think that makes people feel better. But establishing a no-fly zone and forcing Gaddafi to withdraw are two very different issues, and that's not going to be so easy to achieve unless we're very lucky.
And indeed, we'll look at that, but do you think it was the right decision?
At this stage, I'm very, very guarded. On the one hand, there are very strong humanitarian issues to do so, but I'm very concerned that this is not going to turn out as well as we might like it. And so let me just hedge on the issue. If it turns out well, then it was the right decision, but I have some very real reservations, even though I fully appreciate the humanitarian issues that are at stake here.
Well, let's look at how it might work. What happens now? The French are saying that it could be in action within hours. The US are a little more hesitant. They're saying it could be up to a week.
That's a very good question, and there are various strategies that can be used politically. For example, beginning the no-fly zone over Benghazi as a first step. Indeed, if we could have, say, Egyptian and Saudi Air Force assistance to give it an Arab face would be very useful. Then we could build outwards. The most traditional and conventional way of doing this would be a strike against Libyans' air defenses throughout the country, which would probably take a couple of days at most, and then there would be military air attacks against Libyan army forces. It seems to me, however, that that is too massive an approach, and if I were asked, I would start this at the Benghazi side, the eastern part of Libya, and then expand it gradually over time, hoping that that pressure will cause Gaddafi to withdraw. But it seems to me without a credible ground force either threatened or available, and that could be the Egyptian army, it could be some Arab forces, it seems to me dislodging Gaddafi is going to be more difficult than we think.
Well, the UN resolution specifically rules out ground forces. Is that why you see...
It doesn't. No, it doesn't really. If you read it closely, it talks about occupation. And if the provincial government were to invite ground forces in, I think that the UN resolution is elastic enough to allow that to happen.
And is that why you consider it to be so vital that the Arab forces are involved? Because, of course, Egypt...
Absolutely. Absolutely. Without the Arab forces, this has to have an Arab face and a Muslim face. If the Americans were to be overtly seen as leading the operation, I think the politics in the region would turn against us dramatically. As you know, we're not very popular. We're having all sorts of problems in the Gulf. The Saudis have supported the Bahrainis against our wishes, and so the lower the American visible presence, the better. We can provide lots in terms of AWACS, aircraft that are surveillance airplanes. We can provide an awful lot of logistics, tanking, and a lot of intelligence information. But the smaller the American footprint, I think the better off we will be.
And in terms of timing, you talk about advocating starting small and moving out. Time is of the essence, isn't it? Because already Muammar Gaddafi is threatening to storm Benghazi tonight.
Yeah, and I would start with a no-fly zone immediately. I would declare a no-fly zone. I would use some aircraft initially, and we could knock down whatever forces the Gaddafi Air Force was going to put up. But I would declare the no-fly zone immediately. And then I would use a surprise. I would keep Gaddafi off balance by not really showing exactly how far or where or when we're going to do things, and then at some stage be prepared to intervene if necessarily with ground forces to protect Benghazi.
Well, indeed, it's a question that's been posed by the US Air Force Chief of Staff, General Norton Schwartz. He says, is a no-fly zone the last step or the first step? Are you firmly of the view it's the first step?
You bet. General Schwartz is absolutely right when it's not a question, he's making a statement. The no-fly zone is a first step because if this is going to work, we saw what happened in the former Yugoslavia, in Serbia, in 1999. It took 78 days to dislodge Milosevic. We tried to do it all by air, and it wasn't until we finally threatened ground forces that he moved. And I think in this particular case, unless we are prepared to threaten and probably use ground forces, the chances of Gaddafi standing down are far less than they should be.
The point you've made that intervention is a long, drawn-out process. NATO and the US, of course, they're involved in Afghanistan. Is there the resources and is there indeed the appetite of local populations?
There are indeed the resources. The United States has over 200 strike aircraft in Europe. We have aircraft carriers such as Crete and Malta and Italy. NATO has got enormous amounts of capability. The Arab League has enormous amounts of capability. That's not the issue. The first issue is be prepared to use ground forces. Second issue is with whom are we dealing? Do we really trust the revolutionaries? Do we trust the Transition Council? Are there people who are prepared to take over and change Libya, or are we going to replace Colonel Gaddafi with Lieutenant Gaddafi? And finally, do we have the resources for the long haul? Look what happened in Iraq. Look what happened in Afghanistan after military action. Are we prepared to deal with Libya and help in the transition from the Gaddafi regime to the next regime? Now, I think there are answers to all those questions, but we need to get our act together very, very quickly, because if one of those pillars in these three legs doesn't work, the entire edifice could come crashing down.
But do you think that they have answers to those questions already, which one assumes that in many ways they should have before authorising this sort of military activity? Indeed, if you look at what sort of institutions or who may take over, it seems that there is no one single dominant opposition force.
Ali, you put your finger on a problem. I have no idea, and I don't know that we have a really good idea of who's going to be leading a new government, if there is a new government. I think we're going to work that as we go along. I think on the military side there's been a huge amount of planning, but as we have seen in Afghanistan, as we've seen in Iraq, as we have seen in the former Yugoslavia, the civilian side, that is the governance side, that is the aid and assistance side, has been far weaker than the military side. So my concern is that we don't have all the civilian resources that we need, even though the military, I'm sure, has done excellent planning. And when I say military, I don't mean just the American military. I'm sure the British, the French, NATO, and other militaries are deeply engaged. That's the easy part of the problem. The difficult part is what happens next.
How do you think that the Obama administration has handled this crisis?
I think it's done actually quite well. It's taken a lot of beating because it's not been seen to be in the lead as much. I think the fundamental problem was that they opened their mouths too quickly when Obama said that Gaddafi must go and we're tightening the noose. President Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly but carry a big stick. And the only criticism I would make of this administration is that they spoke too quickly without having the big stick in place, and one hopes that the no-fly zone and what happens will happen in sufficient time to prevent a bloodbath in Libya.
Harlan Ullman, I have to ask you one more question, and that is that
Sure.
the UN has decided to act in relation to Libya, but what about other countries? In the last few hours, the UN has condemned what it calls shocking force used against protesters in Bahrain. What about Yemen? What about other countries?
We're at the limits of our willpower and ability. Bahrain is a Saudi issue, and we're not going to take the Saudis on because of oil, and oil. Libya, I think, is something of an exception because Gaddafi has been such an extraordinarily dangerous fellow that the international community has decided it's time for him to go. President Saleh of Yemen is not in that category, and what's going to happen in Bahrain is going to be a repression of the Shia majority by the Sunnis in large measure because the Saudis want that part of the Gulf to be stable and are concerned about the Irans, and that's going to be a bullet that we're just going to have to bite, I'm afraid.
Harlan Ullman, thank you so much for joining us. What is very early hours for you, for giving us your analysis.